Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us Vijay Prashad, well-known writer and commentator on various issues including West Asia. Vijay, is Syria moving towards an endgame at the moment? The Western powers seem to be giving more arms, openly declaring that they are going to give arms to the rebels. Jordan is also getting into the game. We have Qatar taking very aggressive positions as always. Turkey has now patched up with Israel. Are we seeing the situation on the ground for an intervention, if not physically, but at least much more aggressive positions being taken by Western powers as well as their allies over here?
I mean, there's no question that there is a much more aggressive posture, particularly coming out of the United States and its clients in the region. You know, some attempts at cementing broken alliances have been made. So, for instance, in 2010, there was a real breakdown between Turkey and Israel. You know, on many accounts, one of them, of course, was the flotilla. The Mavi Marmara went from Turkey and Israel fired on it, killed Turkish nationals, even in fact one Turkish-American national, a US citizen was killed on that. So the question was, there was a breakdown of relations in 2010, and that actually had till last week, till 10 days ago, that had been the status, that they had really, their relations had almost gone to zero.
Turkey making up with Israel, and Israel has apologized for the Mavi Marmara incidents now. So it's not that Turkey is really backed down. If you look at it, under Obama's pressure, if you will, or brokerage, whichever way you call it, it's Israel who's backed down from its public position. It had nothing wrong that it did on the attacking the flotilla. So if you take all that into account, putting that kind of pressure on Israel to make up with Turkey makes sense if United States is trying to cement all these alliances before a more aggressive posture on Syria. Is that what we are seeing?
There is no question that if there is a bombardment, and if there is a bombardment, it may not come under NATO colors. You know, so far NATO has been very reticent about making any noises about joining any kind of bombing raid on Syria. But on the other hand, the United States Admiral who heads their European command, Admiral Stavridis, has made a statement about some need to have a more aggressive posture. That might signal that the US wants to do something. If the US indeed does some kind of military action, it will need a neighboring country to provide the kind of ground support necessary. And if you look at the geography of Syria for a moment, you know, people have a mistaken belief. They believe that Iran's main ally in the region is Hezbollah. But what I think is not being fully understood is that Iran's main ally in the region is Iraq. And at the moment. And in fact, the US had tried to pressure Iraq to not allow Iranian planes to fly across Iraqi territory into Damascus, and Iraq refused. That means a very large border with Syria is not going to be possible, is not going to be utilizable by the Americans against the Assad regime. The Jordanian border is very possible, and which is why the Jordanians have made a rather extraordinary position where they've talked about a so-called protected space by Jordanian Air Force inside Syrian territory. This is a very dangerous kind of position the Jordanians have taken. Jordan has upwards of 200,000 refugees from Syria. Refugees continue to stream into Jordan. You know, it's the easiest way after Lebanon. Refugees are continuing to stream in. So UN agencies, NGOs that are working with refugees in Jordan at the border are very upset about this attempt to militarize the Jordanian border. But there's no question that even if Jordan came online, the Turkish front is going to be essential. And some people have started to say that if there is a bombardment of Syria, Turkish troops are going to move into northern Syria. And you know, this is all of course highly speculative because the Turkish military has not made any noises
as yet. Again, Turkey trying to take a more aggressive posture. One is of course settling with Israel, and I said Israel has really done the backing down in that. But the other issue is really the PKK and the fact that they have made up with Öcalan, and that could also signal that Turkey is trying to set its house in order for a more aggressive intervention in Syria. Would you read it like that?
Well, you know, again, about a year ago, the Assad regime played a very smart card. What they did was they, after years of being, rather oppressive against the Kurds, suddenly did a 180 turn and said, we are pro-Kurdish and the Kurdistan region of Syria is yours to control. In other words, they ceded autonomy to northern Syria, which borders Turkey. This allowed some sections of the PKK to regroup. The PKK there was a ceasefire, they had dampened their forward posture against the Turkish military. But now and particularly, I forgot to mention in that, during the Iraq war, their bases in northern Iraq had been very constrained, not only by the United States, but also by the new Iraqi government, which was not keen on crossing the US, because the Kurdish autonomous part of Iraq is highly dependent on the United States. So they were very cautious. That meant that bases of the PKK were constrained. So when Assad a year ago said, welcome to Syria or to Syrian Kurdistan, PKK regrouped, sections of them regrouped, and they began again a forward posture against the Turkish military. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Turkey went running to NATO and said, we need Patriot missile batteries, we need help from you. They wanted to cement some kind of wall, and then they continued the political dialogue with Öcalan, with the PKK. Of course, in the middle of this, some shady parts of the Turkish state assassinated 3 important Kurdish leaders in Paris. In a assassination that has not yet fully been explained. What happened, who did it.
One of the arguments is to stop the rapprochement.
That's right. There is a kind of underbelly dark side of the Turkish state, which they believe does not want rapprochement. They want a sort of Sri Lankan solution with the Kurds. But now,
if we take it in the context of Syria, so this has been put, House in some sense has been put in order to have an anti-Assad alliance, a broader alliance. In the same time, you have the Syrian coalition, which Americans and the Qataris have put together. That has almost split, with Ghazim Hito being imposed from outside. Somebody who's not been there for 30 years suddenly is imposed from outside, like Karzai becomes the leader of Afghanistan. The same way, the American Kurds now has become the leader of the Syrian opposition, and that has also created a split within the Syrian opposition ranks.
See, there are 2 ways to look at it. One is you can say that the Americans unfortunately have only one guidebook. It was Ahmad Chalabi in Iraq. It was Hamid Karzai after earlier characters were killed in Afghanistan. It was DM in Vietnam. I mean, they have one guidebook for all their counterinsurgency, imperialist maneuvers. It's a kind of same sort of thing. That's one way to look at Hito's arrival suddenly. When it looked like there's some military gains being made by the rebels, the Americans wanted to assert themselves.
Also, the leader of the Syrian opposition had said, I'm willing to open dialogue with Assad without preconditions.
This is important because you'll remember in the summer, there was the Geneva Agreement. And the Geneva Agreement, to which the Syrian rebel groups and the coalition were almost party, essentially argued that a peaceful solution must be in the offing, and the Assad regime, it was not clear on the role of Mr. Assad himself, but the regime will be part of the process. And this is a position that was not palatable, not just to Washington, but to Doha. In Qatar, they did not want this position. The second problem was that the person favored by sections of the Brotherhood, Mr. Khatib, was not somebody that the Qataris necessarily liked. There is a split between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And not to put too fine a point in, not to say there's a real split in the coalition, because after all, at the Arab League meeting in Qatar, Mr. Khatib, who had resigned his position in disgust at these manipulations and maneuvers, was brought back. He gave a very extraordinary speech at the Arab League. It was rhymed. People may not have caught that. It was a poem, really. It was not just a prose speech. He spoke in a sense like an imam, declaring a certain agenda. And when Mr. Khatib returns, and then Mr. Hito, who was the preferred candidate of the Americans and the Qataris, becomes head of the Syrian National Coalition. In other words, both remain. So in a sense, there is some disgust in the Syrian leadership at the fact that they are being attempted to be manipulated, or indeed manipulated, either way. They may feel disgust, but it is also the case that the hand of these external forces has become so heavy on their shoulders that they are having a hard time turning on their own. And I think this message is something that is not being put out there clearly enough. That, regardless of what one's position is on the internal issues that are taking place in Syria, the hand of empire and the counter-revolution has become extremely heavy on these platforms that have been created on behalf of the rebellion.
And they've been almost created out of nothing by the Qataris in Doha. This particular Syrian council really came out of that. Earlier it was done by Turkey. So it has been obvious from the beginning that they were really being set up from outside by outside forces. The other thing that is important is that there was suddenly this talk about a chemical weapon attack, partly because Obama had laid down the red line of chemical weapons, and it turns out finally that these appear to be chlorine based, therefore more likely to be homemade missiles than something the Syrian regime would have used, because they have certainly far more advanced chemical weapons than this. But that seems to have gone off. The Western media seems to have stopped talking about it after it has appeared that it really was the other side.
Look, the Western media is not a serious entity. Okay, I mean, Syria has been a charnel house. Tens of thousands of people have certainly died. The Western media has neither reported properly what is happening inside Syria, nor has it actually reported the refugee crisis. If the Western media was actually serious about the issue of Syria, the question of the refugee crisis would be front page news. Instead, what the Western media is interested in is the chess game, is the kind of palace intrigue of who is going to be the next leader, things like that. Those are actually...
Vijay, I think you're being very kind to Western media. They have been really saying, how can we create the environment for a justification for a military intervention in Syria?
Plainly.
That's plain and simple.
Yeah.
Or how do you justify what is clearly, in terms of international law, illegal, sending arms to foment civil war in another country?
Precisely. These issues are not on the table. Also not on the table is the still complicated position of Israel. Because despite the fact that Mr. Netanyahu, who's just been re-elected miraculously through a very peculiar election process, nevertheless he called up Erdogan and he, as you said, apologized for the attack on the flotilla. But Israel is not 100% given over, even now, to so-called regime change in Syria.
But they have recently given Jolan gas and oil rights to an American company. So they also are taking advantage of the fact that Syria is in trouble to see how they can make some money out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that they are enjoying the crisis and taking advantage of the opportunities. But the outcome of it, the end game, in a sense, I think there is a strategic harmonization. All these powers are agreed the Assad regime is to go. That they have agreed on. Tactically, they are nowhere near agreement. Give some arms here, give some arms. Some are interested in bombing, others are not, wary. So there is that. But the end game question, that's where they are already focusing. That's where there's a fight in who is the first so-called prime minister. Will it be Hito? Will it be Khatib?
I would like to pose this question to you. Look, if the end game for the West and the Qataris and Saudis is that Assad regime has to go, then something will have to replace.
Correct.
Now, something that replaces it, if you see the military forces on the ground on the opposition side, is one variety of Islamists or the other.
Correct.
There isn't anything else in between.
Precisely.
If you talk about the FSA, it only exists in the air. On the ground, you have various kinds of Islamist formations, with the most extreme being the Jabhat al-Nusra. But others are also of similar ilk in terms of what they believe. And it's very clear that a more fundamental Islamization of the opposition has taken place. So why are they interested in handing over this to Islamist militants who otherwise are supposed to be the main enemy after 9/11? Can you explain this to us?
Look, firstly, one should be very cautious in actually accepting the view that militant Islam is the principal enemy of imperialism. You know, it's precisely not. There was a very good book by Mark Curtis called Britain's Secret Allies, which talks about the relationship of the British with the Islamists.
But that's 50s, 60s,
history.
70s, 80s. Yes,
Absolutely.
With Afghanistan, not so secret history. With various attempts on Nasser made by the CIA using the Muslim Islamic Brotherhood.
Not
a secret history
absolutely.
anymore.
But here's the thing. Here's what's also not secret. You had Mr. Morsi come to power in Egypt. Mr. Morsi is waiting on Thursday. The IMF delegation is coming for a standby agreement. On Wednesday, Mr. Morsi's cabinet will raise the price of cooking fuel, preempting the IMF arrival. Meaning, the West is coming to understand, sophisticated elements in the bloc of imperialism are coming to understand that the Islamists have a retrograde social agenda, but they have no real economic agenda and are in fact quite willing and happy to adopt a neoliberal agenda,
economic.
as Hezbollah
that.
has done, you know, when in office.
I agree with that, you know, the neoliberal agenda has never been a problem with the Islamist forces of either variety,
Correct.
whichever variety you talk about it. But, you know, there is a much larger issue, is that this kind of forces, there is a huge blowback that takes place. I was in Tunisia the other day, and it's interesting, the 12,000 Tunisians are in Syria fighting. Just if you remember, a lot of Libyans were fighting in Iraq, and they're the ones who go back and then start an Islamic revolt of some kind or the other based on Benghazi. Now, this 12,000 Tunisians and similar varieties who are now coming in as jihadists into Syria, at some point are going to go back with military training, with arms and everything. The entire region from North Africa to West Asia, you are destabilizing. And if you destabilize a region, how does it in the long run even help imperialism?
Well, now we come to the essence of the matter. I mean, who said imperialism was interested in stability? Imperialism is interested in managing the crisis in order that its interests are satiated. I mean, they don't have in their rule book that you need to create, you know, rational order-based societies around the world. You know, instability might actually be very useful, very valuable. You know, the last thing the West wants in West Asia is a regional entente to develop. You know, for instance, when after the meeting of the Organization of Islamic Countries, when they created the Syria contact group, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, you know, these countries have so much that divides them. Yet they began a process to start discussing Syria. That had to be scuttled. And the Americans then took the Russians by the hand, took the UN Secretary General by the hand, they met in Spain and said, we don't want to give you a seat at the table. You know, the last thing that they want is a kind of regionalism.
I'm agreeing with you on that the regional forces coming up is not conducive to growth of imperialism. But I also disagree with you on this, that warfare, civil wars, falls of the state, disintegration of the state is also in favor of imperialist in the long term. So, you know, it's basically to play very difficult game where you want fragility but not a breakdown.
Absolutely.
But what they are doing right now, to me, appears post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, post-Libya, now we are seeing Mali, that these policies are leading to large-scale breakdown. And this, in the long run, is not going to help imperialism either. Forget the long run, even in the short run.
Absolutely. But here's the thing to keep in mind about this, that might be something, is that we often assume that imperialism is in control of the contradictions. I mean, the fact of the matter is that they are operating in a terrain where their own choices of maneuver might narrow much more than we would consider. So, for instance, there are some people who believe that the jet engines have already been oiled and revved up and the planes are ready to take off. I'm much more skeptical of that. I think that there is more talk, there are more hints of engagement in Syria than there's actually a stomach for it. And I think that is really what has created the charnel house atmosphere inside Syria. They exaggerated their desire to help, therefore emboldened the rebels. On the other hand, their inaction has emboldened the Assad regime, and between the hammer and the anvil, the Syrian people are dying.
So can we say, Vijay, looking at all this, that imperialism in its decline is far more dangerous in terms of the damage it is creating because precisely of its inability to manage the contradictions anymore. And this is what we are seeing in terms of the disintegration in West Asia as well as in North Africa.
That is exactly what I believe.
Okay, I think that sums it up, that the intent is there but the capability no longer exists, and that is how we are seeing this kind of new battle zones develop. Thank you very much. We will continue to follow the West Asia as well as North Africa and the larger Arab region. Thank you very much.
Thank you.